Good morning. We are getting started with our briefing session this morning. I can tell that groups are staying up later and later and dragging in as we are able. It's a special privilege this morning to have as our guest speaker Sally Curtis AsKew, who is the clerk of the Judicial Council. Sally is a lay person from the North Georgia area who began her professional life as a school teacher and then went to work for the Hinton Rural Life Center for a number of years, decided to go to law school and joined the Georgia Bar in 1987 and promptly got involved with law librarian work and also got involved with the Judicial Council. She served 16 years on the Judicial Council and then after she left that, was invited to become the clerk of the Judicial Council. So Sally has this long historic relationship with the Judicial Council and is able to talk about past work. She's not able to talk about issues that are currently before the Judicial Council. So it is with great pleasure that I'm able to bring Sally forth. Bring Sally forth to come and be with us this morning to talk about the Judicial Council issues.
Thank you, Ann. The Judicial Council gets its authority from paragraphs 55 to 58 of the discipline, which is the constitutional. The Judicial Council is one of three constitutional bodies of the United Methodist Church. The other two are the General Conference and the Council of Bishops. Oftentimes, people think the Judicial Council is like a general agency, but it's very different in many respects. Then the paragraphs in the discipline which deal with the Judicial Council's organization, its duties and responsibilities, that sort of thing, are in chapter 26 of the discipline, which is almost at the end because chapter 27 has to do with trials and that sort of thing. The Judicial Council has a fairly short history in the life of the church. It was not formed in the church until 1939, 1940, when the three branches of Methodism reorganized. Some legal scholars writing about the church say that if it hadn't been for the Judicial Council formation, merger would have never taken place in 1939. That the Southern Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, was afraid of the strong General Conference of the Northern Branch, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Northern Branch was afraid of the Southern bishops who carried all the weight in the South, much less so than the General Conference. But it came into being in 1939, 1940. The Southern Church in the late 30s had had a Judicial Council. Nobody has ever been able to find any written decisions which they gave, and there are no minutes or other historical pieces about those years that we've been able to find so far. We're still looking. I'm still looking for papers of the persons who were on that council. But anyway, in 1940, the Judicial Council issued its first decision. And up through last night, there have been 1,317 decisions. There will be one which will be brought to the floor this morning that was made yesterday. But the Judicial Council is made up of 9 members. Every 16 years, every 8 years, it switches from 5 lay, 4 clergy to 5 clergy, 4 lay. And the years that you can do that, you can figure out when that switch is going to take place, or that the years are divisible by 4, like this one. This is a switch year. For the last 8 years, there have been 5 clergy and 4 lay. But there were 5 persons elected to the Judicial Council on Monday. There are 2 lay and 2 clergy persons who were elected in 2012, and those people will continue until 2020. It is the only part of the church which has 8-year terms. And so you should legally and logically never have more than 5 new members at the time. There are 6 alternates elected for lay and 6 for clergy, and those persons are called in and sit with the Judicial Council in session when other persons are not available. Now, the Judicial Council is given the authority in the Constitution to prepare its own rules and procedures. Those are posted on the judicial portion of the umc.org website. To get to those and to all of the dockets and things, you have to scroll down to the bottom of the opening page and click on organizational structure. And at the bottom of that, first is the General Conference, then the Council of Bishops, then the Judicial Council, and at the bottom of that is a link which says Learn More. And that will take you to the Judicial Council portion, where you will find all of the decisions posted from number 1 through 1316 right now. 1317 will be posted later today. And you will also find the rules of practice and procedure as they're currently in force. And you will find the docket. The rules of practice and procedure call for a docket of all of the things that have been referred to the Judicial Council for spring and fall meetings to be posted on that website, as well as printed in the interpreter. There used to be a couple of other print forms which have fallen by the wayside through the years, and most people don't go for the print anymore. And I expect you all are much more accustomed to working with online things than hunting down print books. The Judicial Council has jurisdiction to do a couple of different kinds of things. One of them is to review all bishops' decisions of law that are made in annual conference sessions. If somebody wants to ask the bishop to rule on some sort of thing, whether what they've done is proper or anything like that, you will see those often in memorandum form, which means a shorter form of the decision. But all of those automatically come to the Judicial Council for review. One of the things that I always laugh about is that there is also a process set out where you can ask the annual conference to appeal the bishop's ruling to the Judicial Council. That takes only 20% vote. And on any given day, in any annual conference, you can find 20% of the people sitting there who are mad with the bishop. But it's sort of unnecessary because the decision is going to come to the Judicial Council automatically. I can only think of a handful of times when it's been appealed through all of those 1,300 plus decisions. The other thing that was not originally in the jurisdiction of the Judicial Council was enacted at the 1944 General Conference. And that is that the Judicial Council is empowered to give an opinion or make a decision. The words in the discipline are in the nature of a declaratory decision. Those decisions are generally asked in annual conference sessions when somebody thinks that a paragraph of the discipline is in conflict with the Constitution, when they think some action that the annual conference has taken is either in conflict with the discipline, excuse me, or with the Constitution. Those are generally more complicated. They can also be asked when somebody thinks there are two paragraphs of the discipline which are in conflict with each other. Those are the majority of the decisions that you see, the declaratory decision ones. There was a lot of conversation about whether or not to give the Judicial Council that power among the Judicial Council members as well as among those at the General Conference in 1944. The Judicial Council materials from 1952 on are pretty thorough at the Archives in History. It was very interesting to me when I began digging into that there are no minutes that were sent from 1940 to 1948. That's an 8-year gap of no minutes, because reading the Judicial Council minutes gives you a feel for what was going on, not only in the Judicial Council, but in the church as a whole, because you see what the decisions were. And this is just a little interesting tidbit. The one thing that has been before the Judicial Council since the very first decision they made is the matter of involuntary retirement of clergy. And the discipline keeps getting worked on, and it never quite works. If somebody gets involuntarily retired, they're almost always going to question it one way or another. The Judicial Council itself organizes, and the new Judicial Council, which was elected, the 5 people elected on Monday and the 4 who are continuing on the council, will have their organizational meeting on tomorrow morning. And that council, which after they organize and elect new officers, will become the Judicial Council of the United Methodist Church immediately following the close of General Conference. The current council will continue to work until the gavel is pounded on Friday night, Friday afternoon, saying that this session of the General Council is adjourned. They work primarily by taking the docket items, which are for the fall meeting due the end of June, for the spring meeting due the end of December. Anybody who wants to can file a brief, and a brief does not have to follow some kind of legal form. You can write a letter and it's still considered a brief. But all of those are gathered by the Secretary of the Judicial Council and sent out to the members of the Judicial Council, usually somewhere shortly after the 1st of September. And most of the time, if you have a docket which tends to run between 15 and 35 items per meeting, you will have a stack of materials about this high that you've got to plow through in preparing. Each docket item is then assigned to 2 members of the Judicial Council to research and draft an opinion on. In the meeting itself, the persons who were assigned to draft on that particular item read aloud their draft opinion. Everybody has a copy of it. Once they've read aloud their draft decisions, the Judicial Council begins to debate which decision they'll take. If they take both of them and meld them together with instructions to the writers to add this from this one and this from this one, that sort of thing. Then it will come back again. Most things usually go through 4 or 5 drafts. They are not lightly made. It takes a while to come to a decision. Decisions themselves are never signed. Any member is free to write either a concurring or a dissenting opinion, which comes at the end of the decision itself. A concurring decision is one which may say something like, I concur with my colleagues on this matter, on the final decision, but I would have gotten to that decision through this process. A dissent says, I don't like this decision. I disagree with it, and here are the reasons why. You will see a fairly large number of concurrences and dissents in the last 25 years. Prior to that time, there were not that many of them. But they are all finished, including concurrences and dissents, by the time adjournment of the Judicial Council takes place. They meet generally beginning on Wednesday and finishing on Saturday, twice a year. There also is a provision for something called oral hearings, which means that anybody who is involved with the decision is going to ask for the opportunity to come and talk to the Judicial Council about what they want. And if there's an opposing side, the opposing side also appears at that time. Oral hearings are granted at the pleasure of the President of the Judicial Council. There's nothing guaranteed about having an oral hearing. They can be very interesting. They can also be very boring, particularly if somebody decides to come and read their brief to you. They're cautioned not to do that, but some people do it anyway. And not until, if there is an oral hearing granted, nothing on that particular docket item is taken up until after the oral hearing is held. They're generally held these days right at the beginning of the meeting, so that once you get through the oral hearings, you work straight through the docket. It sounds like a difficult process. It really sort of is daunting to begin with. You can wonder when you're writing your first draft opinion, as I did in 1988, I don't know what I'm doing. And then suddenly you realize, yeah, I do. I can read the discipline in the Constitution too. And so it's a process that has worked for many years, and I don't anticipate that it will be changed. But the Judicial Council has the right to change that process if they choose to, because they're given the right in the Constitution to work out their own processes and procedures. Now, I'd like to stop now and answer any questions that I can that you have. Yes?
My name is J.R. Atkins. I'm from Candler School of Theology. How's that? My name is J.R. Atkins. I'm from Candler School of Theology, and I understand that there can be some issues dealt judicially during General Conference, and then for some reason some can't, and they have to be addressed later, even though the body has done some work, and then they're kind of demoralized if things don't pass. Can you address the timing? What is it that causes something to be delayed versus during General Conference?
I'll be happy to address that, because I think you'll probably see that in the next day or two. What determines the timing is the amount of time that it takes the Judicial Council to offer an opinion. If it's something that's fairly obvious and somebody just doesn't like the way they voted or something like that, then it could be done quickly and you could get a decision that was asked for Friday morning by Friday afternoon. In 2012, the Plan UMC was brought to the floor on Monday in the first plenary. There was a motion made not to consider that until after it was printed in the Daily Christian Advocate, which couldn't be done until Wednesday at that point because it was so long. It was published in Wednesday's session. A motion was made at that time on Wednesday afternoon to refer it to the Judicial Council. The Judicial Council cannot act until they receive the actual written request. They received that on Wednesday night and immediately went into session. And they literally worked for almost 48 hours straight to get a decision done before the end of General Conference. Had they not done that, there would have been major changes made to boards and agencies, which would have had to be undone if the plan was declared unconstitutional. It was declared unconstitutional. That decision did not come. It was 65 pages long. And you had to go through it with a fine-tooth comb to find all of the possible unconstitutional spots, which was not a quick process. So they worked as hard as they could until Friday afternoon to get a decision back to the floor of the General Conference. I don't anticipate that kind of thing happening this time, but it could. It could. Something was asked yesterday afternoon, so somebody told us, but we've not seen the written request, so we have no idea what it is. Twice this week I've had to go and sit in the Daily Christian Advocate office and beg their patience to find the transcript so that we could actually figure out what was said on the floor, because the question that came to us, or came to the council, was very cryptic. Yes?
Mark Salvacion. I'm a first-year MDiv student at Drew. This General Conference, I understand that there is some proposed legislation to amend the Constitution to have constitutional decisions by the Judicial Council reviewable by either the General Conference or the Council of Bishops. Can you talk about what was motivating that and how that legislation turned out?
Well, I don't really know. I can only tell you that it probably came from somebody who didn't like a decision or decisions of the General Conference. There always is a way for the General Conference to change the disciplinary paragraph, which will moot that decision for future precedents. So I don't know. I don't have any direct knowledge of what that was all about. But that would be my best guess, just from looking at the kinds of things that have come previously. Yes? No, I don't think it.
Hi, Emily Ripley, Candler School of Theology. There's the proposal to create a global book of discipline. And so if that happens and there's a global book of discipline and then other books of discipline, would that change the function of the Judicial Council at all or not, because we're still operating under the same Constitution?
I don't think it'll change the function of the Judicial Council at all. It may change the way the Judicial Council works somewhat, because right now in the U.S., the 5 geographical jurisdictions all have a court of appeals, and that's where any clergy trial that is appealed goes first. Almost always, though, when there is a clergy trial where the person is adjudged guilty at the trial level in the annual conference, it will be appealed to the Jurisdiction Court of Appeals and on to the Judicial Council. That kind of thing could in fact change. Those are disciplinary paragraphs, not constitutional paragraphs. I don't know, I don't think anybody knows at this point exactly what the global book of discipline is going to look like. But the central conferences, for many years now, have had the authority to produce their own discipline. It has to be in line with the Constitution, but the U.S. has not had that possibility. So the discipline itself, as it exists now, is very U.S.-centric. If you just look at the property paragraphs, they really are applicable in most cases just to the United States, not to the rest of the world. So there are some things that could be cared for in that Global Book of Discipline. And apparently there is will be something to come about that in the 2020 General Conference. Does that answer your question? Bob?
Bob Williams, Drew Theological School. Has there been an increase in the workload that has come to the Judicial Council in an environment that is litigious as we now find it?
Absolutely. In the earlier days, they thought if they had 9 or 10 requests for decisions, it was a lot. Today, at least one time, there have been as many as 43 items on the docket. And frankly, it was a fall docket, which is always the heaviest, and some of them had to be deferred to the spring meeting. And I don't anticipate that trend not continuing. It may not get any more, but it's interesting because if you look at the big picture, and because I've been around so long, coming up on 30 years now, I have a sort of big picture view of things. You will see that in the mid-year of the quadrennium, the number is the largest that you will have. People have gotten accustomed to the new discipline, that sort of thing. Then the year before General Conference, the fall meeting of the year before and the spring meeting just before General Conference generally have the least number of questions. People who are not happy with something are hoping that they can get General Conference to change it so they don't ask the Judicial Council questions. You just don't ever know what's going to happen. Yes?
Linda Steffen, Candler. And I don't know if you've researched this, but I wondered if you have any sense of the judicial decisions in, especially the 20th century, the trajectory with central conferences and their ability to adapt. Has there been a move toward more openness and allowing more adaptation or opposite?
Well, yes. I mean, if in fact something comes to the Judicial Council from one of the central conferences, if it is related to something in that discipline that central conference has produced, then yes, the Judicial Council respects what they have done. And oftentimes they have to get the disciplinary paragraphs translated from another language so that they can understand what it is. That's one of the interesting things that's going to happen in this next quadrennium. 5 of the members of the new Judicial Council do not have English as their first language. So translation may be a real issue for some of those people. Some of them speak very good English. We've never had to have simultaneous translation in a Judicial Council meeting to this point. It's my understanding that one of the new members is a Portuguese speaker and will require translation in the meeting. Until 2008, the Secretary of the Judicial Council was the one who did the majority of the work because it was all paperwork kinds of things. All of the briefs and records came to you. You sorted them, you shipped them out, that sort of thing. And in 2008, the General Conference adopted a provision to allow the Judicial Council to have a part-time clerk. That's when I became the clerk, was in 2008, when they asked me to do that. And I've done some things that the secretary had always had to do before. I laugh and say, and to some extent this is really true, I'm the Judicial Council's gopher. When they need something, I go find it. I spent yesterday morning several hours running down email addresses, running down other information that they had asked for. I spent yesterday afternoon about an hour sitting in the DCA office getting the transcript of what had happened yesterday morning. So what I do can change from day to day. I do post the decisions on the website. I've been given that authority by United Methodist Communications. I have a password to get in, that sort of thing. And so I post the decisions directly there.
Hi, Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, Union Theological Seminary. I wondered at your local church or when you visit other local churches, how do you explain sort of the process of the judicial system and church trials and this whole litigious part of Methodism when you're talking to someone who's maybe new to Methodism or you're trying to explain, like, why is this important and the values behind it?
Well, one of the main values behind it comes from the Constitution, and that is that the Constitution gives every clergy person, the right to trial by a group of peers. And so that's a starting point. It depends on where you are as to what you explain and how interested the people in that church are. I did it in my own local church last year as part of a class that our pastor was having for people who had not grown up in the United Methodist Church. And so I just worked to try to explain it as simply as possible. I had a handout that's even shorter than what you all have. It does not make sense to a lot of people, granted, because we are the only denomination which has this sort of process. And it's for the protection of the clergy as well as the protection and of the church itself as dealing with constitutional matters.
Thank you.
Yes.
Mark Savassione again from Drew. During the life of the Judicial Council, has the jurisdiction or the finality of the Judicial Council ever been challenged in federal or state court, and what was the outcome?
Well, I don't think an issue has been of the finality has not been before. The Judicial Council from time to time does in fact get sued, just like the church does. And the answer to that is that you do not have jurisdiction over us because it is a church matter entirely and not a matter for the civil courts. If you read through the paragraphs on trials, if a clergy person who has charges brought against him or her chooses to go to civil court for any reason, they lose all right to the church process. Yes. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
More than one time when I was secretary, I had to say that they had no jurisdiction over and that we could not be sued and sign my name. And that was one place my Georgia bar number came in handy.
Nelson Furtado, Candler. Is there any research or study being made on how the decisions of the Judicial Council affect the polity of the church?
I don't know that there's been any specific thing done, but there have been papers written from time to time about different issues before the Judicial Council. There were a number of scholarly papers written about 2006, I think, about one decision that the Judicial Council made. In fact, Rex Matthews, one of your professors, wrote one of them. But that sort of thing happens, yes. And there are times when the Judicial Council is very plain and says, we can't do anything about this, therefore you need to ask General Conference. Judicial Council takes seriously that it's not its prerogative to legislate. Okay, no other questions. Thank you very much for having me, and if you see me around, I'll be glad to answer any other questions that happen to come through your mind. You do have a handout, and at the bottom of it is a citation to an article that entitled A Brief History of the Judicial Council, which was written in 2011.
That can be found online.
Yes, it can be found online. That's true. Thank you, Bob. I got the online citation for somebody the other day.
Let's give our thanks to Sally.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me. And by the way, I'm retiring at the end of this General Conference.
Oh, are you?
I am.
Oh, my gosh. I have to. Sally is an icon of the conference, of the General Conference life, and it's just been a joy to get to have you with us this morning. And
Thank you very much.
Not on behalf of the Judicial Council, but about
the Judicial Council. I'm always happy to do that. And you can probably find me online if you need to ask me another question sometime later also.
There you go. You'll be wandering around until Friday, right?
I'll be wandering around until Friday, and I'll always be open to questions that people need to ask.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.